Heavenly Father, may your Spirit descend into our hearts this evening as we consider the threats for your sacred blessings bestowed on our nation. May be it our prayer that your Spirit once again fill the mighty sails that power this republic onward faithfully onto our manifest destiny until the day of your return. That power of your word and your holy name be once again honored and praised in homes and schools everywhere to the highest offices of our land. Protect, dear God, those in defense of our nation and stationed abroad. Protect our president, strengthen him in faith and courage. Direct us in the protection and maintenance of our Constitution, we humbly pray in your service. Amen.
Amen. That was a great one. Thank you, Bob. Mike, Hyatt,
Right here.
could you lead us in the pledge and the
I sure
flags
will.
are back here?
I pledge allegiance
to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
Thank you, Mike. I do see a few new faces tonight, and so if this is your first time for Campaign for Liberty, we are a grassroots organization focused on restoring our Constitution and reclaiming our republic so that the future comes. I think what we're going to do, we'll start out with Bob Rachel was going to talk about a project. Do you mind, Bob, just a couple minutes just to share with the efforts that you're making on the Making of America seminar? I'll let you come up and say something. You.
Folks, some of you have expressed an interest in attending a seminar for the Making of America, the one-day seminar. And what we found is very difficult to make schedules work, but we want to offer an opportunity for folks to do this also in their homes with their friends, neighbors, and church groups. I think it's really important that we take a hard look at maybe changing our demographic, maybe young people more. We've been struggling and trying to get a few people here and a few people there. Our hope was that maybe we would get 100 people through this year. We're not going to make that, I don't believe. And so we're not going to give up on doing seminars necessarily, but we want to get these into the hands of people that can go ahead and do these in their homes. And this particular course will change the direction of any legislator who currently serves in office, especially the liberals. We know that we have people like Chuck here who probably will not be altered because he's already on the right side of everything. We have, we're including the book, the video seminar, and I'm also including the 5,000-year elite book, which is really the primer. It's really important. It's got the 28 principles. The last book written by Dr. Cleon Skousen. I'm also including a free gift. It's a More Perfect Union, a beautiful movie on a reenactment of the writing of our Constitution. Anybody that watches this movie, I think you will really be heartfelt for what it really entailed to do the Constitution. I'm only asking that you consider a $25 donation if you can, and even if you can't, we still want to get these into people's hands. $25 is less than what I have invested in them, but I really want to get these out, and so let me know. We will have a few of them back here. I've got more in the car. We have the guidebooks. I have more guidebooks available for anybody that wants to do this with their families or whatever. So, thank you.
Thanks, Bob. And you know what's so neat about Bob, you know, he's a former legislator, and he still just keeps fighting the fight for all of us, really remaining active and trying to make change in our state. And then I would like to also draw attention to Representative Chuck Ray, who's with us tonight, and we love Chuck as well. And our Republican State Party Chairman, Mr. Frank Ehorn, he's at the back, and he's just been doing some amazing work. So with all of you guys and all of these wonderful leaders, we're going to make some great changes here in our state, all for the good. Okay, I tell you, I'm so excited. This poor Robert Brown, our constitutional scholar, our special speaker from John Birch Society, who's going to teach us so much tonight. Poor guy, I've already been talking this, just bombarding him with questions. And so I think he has some really good things that we can implement here in Wyoming. And just one thing, I'm going to shut up so he can start his presentation. But I just wanted to tell you, in the middle, sometime during the middle of the thing, I'm going to pass around a donation bucket just to help cover his travel expenses. So just, unless you already put something in there, don't worry about it. But I will sort of interrupt, and I'll just quietly go up and down the aisles. Let's see. And then, I don't know if Robert's going to talk about that, but there have been, this last session, there were several bills that were connected to various Article 5 Constitutional Convention bills. There was one to rescind the balanced budget bill that passed. I think that was last year? Was it 18 or?
I think it was 2 sessions ago.
17? Okay, 17. So anyway, we will have a question and answer session when Robert's done. So, but we'll let him go ahead with his slideshow, and that's good.
All right, thank you.
Should I turn these off first, or you want to talk a bit, and then I'll turn them off so you can see them? Or?
I think you'll be able to see okay
With the lights on,
See,
you
yeah.
think? Okay.
I think so. Let me know once we get the slides up
Okay.
if we need to do that. Okay, I think I turned this on. Turn up a little bit here. That one doesn't work on there. There we go. There, that sounds on. I like a wireless mic because I tend to wander a little bit. At least visibly. I'll try to stay on topic. I'll give you just a quick introduction about myself, and really how I got to where I am today politically. It really all began with this man. His name's Paul. He was a neighbor of mine about 15 years ago, and as a good neighbor, he invited me to a course on the U.S. Constitution, which he informed me was going to be held in my living room. And so I showed up. The reason I start off with this was because this was life-changing to me. I'd always thought the Constitution was a good thing and knew nothing about it specifically, but that we should be upholding it, right? Couldn't tell you anything else beyond that, really. I went through this course, and it taught me a few very key things. Number one, you might want to stay sitting down while I give you this one. This one's a shocker. We're not really following it anymore. You all are nodding and agreeing. Okay, you saw that one coming. But number two, and more importantly, if we were to be following the Constitution as written, as intended, how different would things be in our nation today? What would that change? And there are a lot of things I could point to that would change. But that's one of the things I began to learn over a dozen years ago when I went through this course, is how much that would change things. One key that I learned was when it comes to budgeting, our federal budget. It would trim somewhere around 80% of the federal budget. That's massive. And by the last time I ran the numbers, it would give us almost a $3 trillion surplus annually. That's staggering. Might be able to actually start paying down the national debt. But the biggest deal there is how much would that change across our country? How much less would the federal government be even on people's minds? Anyway, I could spend all night just on this topic. That's not the topic I'm here to talk about. But happy Constitution Day. There's nothing I'd rather be doing than talking about the Constitution and preserving and protecting it. In fact, I would love to spend a couple extra hours tonight and dive into the Constitution itself, and let's talk about that. I also mentioned earlier to a few that I have probably about 12 hours worth of material on this topic. So who's up for a big marathon speech? I'll keep talking, you keep sitting, right? Someone once told me that the mind can only absorb as long as the backside can endure. So we'll actually just cover a little bit of material tonight. And then question and answers, we might get into some more material as well. The reason I bring up Paul is because of the effect he had on my life. Does anyone have someone like that in your life that was that impetus, the one that kind of sparked you? And have you ever been that for somebody else? That's an interesting thought, isn't it? Because if we can be that spark for somebody else to become aware and politically active, what a difference that can make. What he has done for me has turned me into, today I'm a nationally known constitutional scholar. I have a 6-lecture DVD course, it's right here, called The Constitution is the Solution. It's being used in thousands of homes all across the country today. So what he did that one time, hosting that one class in my home, has led to a lot, hasn't it? Now thousands of people have gone through my course and learned the basics of the Constitution and how to defend it. And that's just one person that he influenced. How far can that spread? So what I want to go into tonight, though, Constitution Day, what I consider the greatest threat to our Constitution isn't the federal government. It isn't the Supreme Court. It isn't whatever else. That way it's the agenda to change it and possibly get rid of it. The Article 5 Convention I consider one of the biggest threats. Now other people feel like it's our only hope. And how do we reconcile those two views? Hopefully through good information. My favorite quote from John Adams. Y'all heard of John Adams? Okay, yeah. Comes from when he's defending some British soldiers, Boston Massacre. You guys familiar with that story? My favorite quote from him is, "Facts are stubborn things." And so there are two sides to this argument. There are those who say the Article 5 Convention is our only hope. It was put in the Constitution to save us from an out-of-control federal government. And on the other hand, there are people like me saying it's a Trojan horse. And I don't want you to trust me on that. I want you to see evidence for yourself and know for yourself so that you are armed, that when someone comes to you, you know the facts. You have the evidence to refute claims. Because the Article 5 Convention, really we can dispel a lot of the myths with evidence. Favorite quote from Patrick Henry. I have a favorite quote from every founding father, I think. This is my favorite from Patrick Henry. "We are apt to shut our eyes against a painful truth and listen to the song of that siren until she transforms us into beasts. This is a part of wise men engaged in a great and arduous struggle for liberty. Are we disposed to be of the number who, having eyes, see not, having ears, hear not, the things which so nearly concern their temporal salvation? For my part, whatever anguish of spirit it may cost, I am willing to know the whole truth, to know the worst and to provide for it." I love the passion. That just gives me chills. This is when he's talking to others in the founding era, how much we need to stand up and defend our independence, and declare our independence, become separate from Great Britain. Put off the shackles of tyranny. But this attitude is one that I try to remember because I'm a little bit opinionated. You might notice that tonight. And occasionally I've found, very rarely, that I'm actually wrong. It has happened once or twice. Where I'm actually wrong about something that I've formed an opinion on. I want to ask you this question. What if you were wrong about something? A strongly held belief supported by numerous celebrities. They're all endorsing this idea, like a convention, for example. And yet the evidence turns out to be false. There's overwhelming evidence in the opposition. This is exactly the position one of my state legislators found himself in. A couple of years ago, this man, there he is, Representative Brad Cheetah, was the bill sponsor for an application for an Article 5 convention. Let me pause on that for a moment and just ask a quick question. Who in the room is familiar with what an Article 5 convention is? And then second, raise your hands, who's not? A few. Okay, let me just define what this is first. You always want to know what we're talking about. In the Constitution, in Article 5, there are two ways of making changes to the Constitution. The first one is the only one we've ever used. Congress proposes an amendment. 2/3 of the House vote in favor of it, 2/3 of the Senate vote in favor of it, then it goes out to the states for ratification, 3/4 of the states ratify it, and then becomes an amendment to the U.S. Constitution. That's the only way we've ever made amendments to the Constitution. The other way is if 2/3 of the state legislatures apply to Congress for a convention, then Congress calls a convention for proposing amendments to the Constitution. And then whatever that convention comes up with is submitted out to the states for ratification. Again, requiring 3/4 of the states for ratification. In both methods, that ratification could be 3/4 of the state legislatures, or it could be 3/4 of special conventions in each state, bypassing the state legislature. And Congress gets to choose which one of those is used. Have they ever used the second one? Anyone know? Bypass state legislatures and have special ratifying conventions held in each state? 21st Amendment, good job. The repeal of prohibition. And interestingly, one of the last states to ratify the repeal of prohibition was one of the states where the legislature was most against repealing prohibition, Utah. But because Congress chose the ratification of conventions rather than state legislatures, Utah ratified rather than opposed. Interesting. Anyway, that's just a little bit of side information, but we've never used the Article 5 convention mode for proposing amendments to the Constitution. In fact, just after the Constitution was first ratified, and we still hadn't established the Bill of Rights. You might remember that history as well. It was a couple of years before we got the Bill of Rights. A lot of states ratified the Constitution with the understanding that, hey, if we ratify this, we are getting a Bill of Rights, right? Okay, here's our submissions and so on. So during that time, before the Bill of Rights were established, some states began proposing we should establish the Bill of Rights through an Article 5 convention. Let's use this new clause in this new Constitution. And Madison wrote several letters and such speaking against using an Article 5 convention, warning against it. It would be a very dangerous route to add amendments to. We'll show you some of why. Getting back to Brad Cheetah now, as he was the bill sponsor a couple of years ago in Montana, which is where I'm from. He was sponsoring a bill for, let's have the state of Montana legislature apply to Congress for this Article 5 convention. The particular one he was the bill sponsor for was the Convention of States, for those that are familiar with that one. And the week that his bill was coming up for committee, on Wednesday, the prior Monday, he was booked for a radio show. We have one statewide talk radio show across Montana, and he was to be interviewed on there back-to-back with me as kind of a gentleman's debate over the topic. And so he presents his side on why this is needed. And then I took my turn and explained why it's a dangerous idea and why the real solution the founders pointed to was Article 6, not Article 5. And his response was, I've never heard of that. Tell me more about I need to learn more about this Article 6 solution. I've never been in a debate with someone like that just humbly says, I've never heard of that, tell me. And admits they don't know. That was quite an interesting turn of events. And then the following Wednesday, I'm there at the committee hearing to testify against his bill. And just before the meeting begins, he pulls me aside and says, nice to finally meet you, and just so you know, I'm going to be testifying against my own bill. Here's some of his testimony. If I thought the Article 5 Convention was going to be the answer, I would be its most firm and staunch defender. Article 6 of the Constitution is a more appropriate measure to use to change things in our country. That is amazing to me. How often have you been able to do that type of a thing, where you publicly formed your opinion, stated it to the world, and then, hi, I was wrong about this, and I'm going to explain why I was wrong? Have you ever done that? That's tough, isn't it? Interestingly, the same type of thing happened in Nevada a few years prior. This is actually 1989. The Nevada Legislative Assembly, they had applied for an Article 5 convention. And then as they got more information, they discovered this was sold to us on false information, false pretenses. And as we look deeper into the evidence, it doesn't hold up. And they issued a rescission of their application for an Article 5 convention, declaring they had been induced by fraud to apply for a convention. It's pretty strong words, isn't it? You can tell they were a little bit upset as they discovered what they had been promised about the Article 5 convention did not hold up to the evidence. Because when those that are promoting a convention to our state legislators, they make a lot of promises to them. We're going to go through a few of those. And those promises cannot be backed by facts. This man, Richard Fry, put it best. When an honest man finds he is wrong, he either stops being wrong or he stops being honest. That's true, isn't it? And Representative Brad Cheetah recognized that he was wrong. And he testified against his own bill. How many times have you ever seen that happen in a state legislature? Bill sponsor decides, you know, I was wrong about this, I'm going to testify against my own bill. That was interesting. So, I want to go through some of the claims. Because convention states and other organizations, I'm going to use them specifically, but pretty much any organization that's promoted, we need to have an Article 5 convention. They're going to make certain reassuring claims to the state legislatures to make them feel like this is a safe process, this is what we need to do. This is one that's very common lately. An Article 5 convention is not a constitutional convention. Anyone ever hear that claim made? Yeah. Why do they say that? Because it's an amendments convention, yeah. Is there a difference by legal definitions? No. Here's the difference. Here's the deal. If you were to grab a law dictionary and look up the term constitutional convention, what does it say? It says a constitutional convention is a convention for drafting a new constitution or proposing amendments to an old constitution. Is one of those options something we're talking about here? With Article 5 convention? Yeah. In fact, most law dictionaries in the country today conclude with an example of the term. An Article 5 convention is a constitutional convention, according to the example they use in it. If I can remember the exact wording, I can jump to it. The exact wording is something to the effect of an Article 5 convention or constitutional convention may be called upon the application of 2/3 of the legislatures of the states. So by legal definition, the term constitutional convention legally means either a convention for creating a new constitution or a convention for drafting amendments. Why do they then demand that it is not the same thing? This actually dates back to about 6 years ago when Professor Robert Nadelson, we'll come back to him a little bit later as well, Professor Robert Nadelson gave a speech saying we need to stop calling it a constitutional convention. At which point, the majority on the conservative side, most started saying it's not a constitutional convention once he said that. Why would he do that? Because of what it brings to people's minds. That when you hear the term constitutional convention, it brings a negative mindset. Because back in 1983, we got this close to having it. 34 states, that's 2/3 of the states. 34 states applying for a convention would trigger the convention. We have 32. We were 2 states away in 1983. And at that point, the tables turned, the tide turned, and states began rescinding their applications for a convention, largely due to the efforts of the John Birch Society and Legal Forum, educating on the other side of the argument. And what that created, when they got that close and then pulled away, was national knowledge. People began to notice this movement and began to hear that this constitutional convention, which they freely called it at the time, was a dangerous idea. In other words, the stigma left by the defeat in 1983 made it so the term constitutional convention was a bad name. And so calling it something else just kind of separates from that past. But is it legitimately a proper term to use? According to any law dictionary, yeah, if you believe dictionary definitions, it is. It's a proper term to use. And so when they tell you it's not a constitutional convention, the number one question I ask is very simply this. Can you find for me an unbiased, authoritative source for a definition of that term constitutional convention that defines it in a way that does not apply to Article 5? What do you think the answer to that is? No. Well, no. There isn't one. No definition of constitutional convention excludes Article 5. So when they tell you it's not a constitutional convention, that's not true. But what is it? An Article 5 convention, is it a convention for creating a completely new constitution? Not necessarily. Can't be limited is the next question. We'll get to that in a moment. The Runaway Convention. If you were to have a convention with limits on it, and it ignores those limits, that's what we call a runaway convention. And they'll tell us the Runaway Convention is a myth. The 1787 Convention is the most prominent one pointed to. What was the 1787 Convention? That was the one where the Constitution was formed 232 years ago, is that right? Yeah. The 1787 Convention is really the precedent for a convention today. And the Convention of States Organization will firmly declare that they were fully authorized to do what they did in the 1787 Convention. We'll explore some historical record on that. Next one, an Article 5 convention will be completely controlled by the state legislatures. In other words, if the state legislatures say this is for a balanced budget amendment only, that's the only thing you talk about, then that's the only thing they can talk about. And then the last one here, changes would have to be ratified by 38 states, which is 3/4 of the states, legislatures, or amendments, conventions, which isn't usually mentioned there. And no foolish amendments could get through. Is that true? Does the 3/4 ratification requirement prevent bad amendments from being ratified? Can anyone think of any that have been ratified that probably shouldn't have been? 16th and 17th Amendment are the most notable for me. So it is possible to get bad amendments through that. It's a high bar, so I'll give you that. On the last one here, the Article 5 Convention is for reining in and out of control government, and it's the only way. So these are the claims that are being told to our state legislatures. And every one of them is false. And I can prove that. We'll go through each of those. The claim the state legislatures will control the convention, and the ratification process will block any bad amendments. There are a couple of problems with this. First problem is historical precedent. Let's go through the historical precedent. And again, I want you to, if you can, take notes. Write down references. If you want to ask me, I can send you some of these references as well. Patrick Henry tells us, I have but one lamp by which my feet are guided, and that is the lamp of experience. I know no way of judging the future but by the past. What does the past tell us about the ability of states to control their delegates and to restrain a convention? Historical precedent. The 1787 convention, where our Constitution was formed, there were really two camps, two fields of thought among the delegates at that convention. There were some who said, wait a minute, we're proposing a new constitution here? We don't have that power. We were given delegate commissions from our states, and by those commissions, we don't have the authority to create a new constitution. We only have the authority to make amendments to the Articles of Confederation, the existing constitution. So that was one of the two sides of the argument. And on this side, there were quite a few. Patrick Henry, thereafter, he's saying that they exceeded their power is perfectly clear. His opinion was they did overstep the bounds that were set by their state legislatures. Robert Whitehill, during the Pennsylvania ratifying convention, he says it is clear that they set aside the laws under which they were appointed. Further down there, they have overthrown that government which they were called upon to amend. Does he believe that they overstepped their bounds? Yeah. In fact, the Pennsylvania ratifying convention is quite interesting. There was quite a long discussion in that convention about whether or not the 1787 convention, where the Constitution was written, whether they had exceeded their authority. And the conclusion was yes. They all agreed, yes, they did exceed their authority, but we're going to accept that anyway. It's kind of interesting. Another one here. This is William Patterson. This was a delegate from New Jersey during the 1787 convention. Again, when they brought forward that we're not just making changes to the Articles of Confederation, we're proposing a completely new form of government. He says, we need to return to our states and obtain larger powers and not assume them of ourselves. We don't have the power to do this. Let's go back and get authorized before we proceed. Two others. This also directly from Madison's notes from the 1787 convention. Charles Pinckney and Elbridge Gerry. Pinckney expressed a doubt whether the act of Congress recommending the convention or the commissions of the deputies, meaning the commissions from the states, would authorize a discussion of a system founded on different principles from the federal constitution. So he's saying, I don't think we have the authority to create a new form of government. Mr. Gerry seemed to entertain the same doubt. A couple more here. John Lansing, New York delegate. The acts of Congress, the tenor of the acts of the states, the commissions produced by the several deputations all proved the power of the convention was restrained to amendments of the federal nature, not creating a new constitution. He actually ended up leaving the convention because he felt like, I don't have the authority by my state to do this, I'm out of here. He didn't come back. Luther Martin, delegate from Maryland. We apprehended one reason to prevent the states meeting again. He's saying we should never have another convention like this. That when they discovered the part this convention had acted and how much its members were abusing the trust reposed in them, the states would never trust another convention. Have we? We haven't. We've never had another convention like that in 232 years. He was right, at least so far. So we do have, now remember, this is just one side of the argument. There were two sides to the argument. What was the other side? The other side, yeah, you're probably right, we don't have the power, but we should proceed anyway. We need to do this. For example, Edmund Randolph. Mr. Randolph was not scrupulous on the point of power, their authority. And the salvation of the Republic is at stake. It would be treason to our trust not to propose what we found necessary. In other words, I'm not so worried about what the states authorized us to do. We need to do what we need to do. Put in modern English. Alexander Hamilton said essentially the same thing. To rely on and propose any plan not adequate to these exigencies, these urgent needs, merely because it was not clearly within our powers, would be to sacrifice the means to the end. Are we here to fix this or not? Never mind what the states authorized us to do, let's do what we need to do. That was kind of the prevailing thought among this side of the argument. Even James Madison was therefore essential that such changes be instituted by some informal and unauthorized propositions. And George Mason, responding to John Lansing, who left the convention, I mentioned earlier, there were, besides, certain crises in which all the ordinary cautions yielded to public necessities. He's again arguing, saying, we need to not worry about the limits of power the states gave us and just proceed. And what about the third option? It's well within our power. We hear this a lot too. In fact, Convention of States will regularly tell us that the 1787 Convention acted well within the authority of their state delegate commissions. And how many founding fathers said that? How many delegates at the 1787 Convention said that? Huh? None. If they had full authority from their delegate commissions, none of them knew it, because nobody in the 1787 Convention made that argument. When they were arguing on whether or not they had the power to proceed, nobody said, yes, we have the power to proceed. Why? Because they didn't? Is there any other option here? Why would none of them know if they actually had the authority? Do you see there's a problem here? There's a real problem with the argument that is being given to our state legislators. The 1787 Convention had full authority to make the changes they made. None of them thought so. That is a new argument that's only happened in the last few years. The 1787 Convention had full authority. It was never an assertion in the 1700s or 1800s. That's what you call historical revisionism, to rewrite history. Do you see a problem with this? Do you see why Nevada said we were induced by, what's their word? Fraud. When they're given arguments, when they're given reassurances like this, don't worry, conventions have never overstepped their bounds. The states can control their convention. Just look at 1787, they controlled their convention. Did they? Did the state legislatures who sent their delegates with specific instructions, were they actually effective in controlling their delegates? Is there any refutation to that? As I mentioned to Mark before we started tonight, I don't want you to trust me on these things. I want you to know for yourself. I want you to look up evidence, know these things for yourself so you can defend this. Because in Wyoming, we have a battle here. The Convention of States organization is trying to get their bill passed. Another organization, the Balanced Budget Amendment Task Force, has their bill passed here. So that was on the books and needs to be rescinded. But we need to have good information to drive out bad information. Right? So, from here, there are a few other quotes I want to share, just to give a little bit more 1787 perspective. Judge Caleb Wallace, this is a really interesting perspective. About a year later, half a year later, 1788, he was a supporter of this new constitution, but he was so concerned about the precedent that was set by having a convention that did not obey their delegate commissions, that he was advocating we need to do over. Yeah, I like the result of the convention, but we need to start over and do the entire convention over again. I'll use his words. I think that calling another convention should not be delayed for the single reason, if no other, that it was done by men who exceeded their commissions. And whatever may be pleaded in excuse for the necessity of the case, something certainly can be done to disclaim the dangerous precedent, which would otherwise be established. So answer me this one simple question. What is the precedent for future conventions that the 1787 convention established? What does it tell us? Can states control the convention? Based on 1787? No. No. Is there any evidence out there to refute that? There isn't. I engage in debates on this topic several times a week. It's kind of fun. I enjoy debating. I always try to keep it as gentlemanly as possible. Some people are really easy to debate that way. Others tend to get angry when they can't respond. So, but I posed that question numerous times. I posed the question of find me a source for the term constitutional convention doesn't include Article 5, thousands of times. The answer is always the same. They don't have an answer. One more quote. This one's striking. So, did the 1787 Convention act illegally? That's kind of an uncomfortable question, isn't it? I've had a number of people say, oh, well, I can't refute what you just said, but let's change the argument. So you must believe the 1787 Convention acted illegally and the Constitution was illegally adopted. No, I don't. On this, I agree with James Madison, and I'll use his words. What authority did the 1787 Convention propose the Constitution with, if it wasn't the authority they were given by their states? Because obviously the authority they were given from their states did not authorize them to do what they did. What authority did they use? If you read Federalist 40 and highlight the word people, about 3/4 of the times the word people is used in Federalist 40 is the answer to this question. Here's one of them. This one actually doesn't come from Federalist 40, but it's the same explanation. This one actually comes from his notes in the 1787 Convention. He says, the people were in fact the fountain of all power, and by resorting to them, all difficulties were got over. They could alter constitutions as they pleased. What did he just say there? Yes, we have these limits of power from the states. But as we turn to the authority of the people, which one has a higher authority? We, the people, are the highest authority in the land, right? So by resorting to the people, fountain of all power, they now have no limits on what they can do. This limited convention now becomes a convention of limitless power. See how that works? Now what does he mean by resorting to them? How did they resort to them? Go ahead.
They won them over by their articles in the papers.
Yes, the Federalist Papers, for example, things like that. There's even more to it than that. They actually very legitimately appealed to the power of the people by doing one very specific act, and that was they changed the ratification process. Under the existing Constitution, the Articles of Confederation, Article 13 said, any changes made to the Constitution must be approved by Congress and afterwards approved by the legislatures of all 13 states. In addition to that, the delegate commissions, remember the rules the delegates were under? The delegate commissions from 9 states echoed that requirement to their delegates, reminding them that whatever changes you come up with in the 1787 Convention, it will need to be approved by Congress and also ratified by all 13 state legislatures. What is the likelihood of that happening in 1787? Well, they knew it was about 0, because one state didn't even bother showing up to the convention, that being Rhode Island. And Rhode Island wrote them a letter saying, yeah, we're not there at the convention, here are our reasons why, but just remember Article 13 requires you to get our permission and our approval on whatever you come up with. So now you have 10 states, 9 state commissions, and Rhode Island saying, whatever you come up with must follow, approved by Congress and all 13 state legislatures. Is that what they did? No. Anyone familiar with Article 7 of the U.S. Constitution? It says the ratification of the conventions of 9 states shall be sufficient for the establishment of this Constitution. How many states? Not 13? Okay, so they just lowered the bar, didn't they? And did they mention state legislatures in there? The ratification of the conventions of 9 states. So the convention means we're not going to even ask the state legislators if they want to ratify. We're going to bypass them and go right to conventions representing the people themselves. And in some states, like Rhode Island, it literally was every voter had a vote on whether or not to ratify the new Constitution. They literally were going right to the people in some cases. That is how they resorted to the people. And as you read Federalist 40, Madison refers to the people. That's what he's talking about over and over again, was this plan that we're going to change the ratification process and go to the highest authority of the land, the people themselves. And by doing so, we can totally ignore any limited power our states have given us. What precedent does that set? Remember how I said in Article 5 there are 2 ways to propose amendments, and there are also 2 ways to ratify? You can go out to the states, and the state legislatures could ratify, or it can be special ratifying conventions in each state. Well, this proposes a third option. That, like 1787, the convention could propose their own ratification process. And in fact, one law professor, Sanford Levinson, has suggested that's exactly what a convention should do, and change the ratification process to a simple majority vote of the American people. How many trust the simple majority vote of the American people to choose a good president for us in the next election? How many trust the simple majority vote of the American people to ratify common sense gun control measures? I believe that could pass a simple majority vote of the American people if the media was pushing it enough, like they are right now. Yeah. Could that be brought up at a convention like this? If the convention was for only a balanced budget amendment, the state said so in their delegate commissions. You can only talk about a balanced budget amendment. Could that convention bring up, while we're here, we want to also modify the Second Amendment? Could they, based on this precedent? Did they do essentially the same thing in 1787? They did, didn't they? They said, hey, while we're here, we need to address a few other issues. And we'll just turn it over to the people, and that makes it legitimate. That's the precedent. So the first problem convention promoters have is historical precedent. What's the other problem? Well, legal precedent. Are there any legal decisions that have also supported the same concept here? Yes, actually quite a few. For example, throughout the states, as they've had state conventions, the 1787 precedent was that the convention represented who? The people, not the states, right? Well, guess what states have said? State courts all across the country repeatedly have said the exact same thing with their state conventions. The members of Constitutional Convention are the direct, now notice they use that term. In legal terms, the Constitutional Convention term is always used. So when they tell you it's not a Constitutional Convention, we're kind of messing with legal terms here. The members of the Constitutional Convention are the direct representatives of the people. And as such, they may exercise all sovereign powers that are vested in the people of the state. They derive their powers not from the legislature, but from the people. And hence, their power may not in any respect be limited or restrained by the legislature. Let me read that last part again. Their power may not in any respect be limited or restrained by the legislature. Under this view, it's a legislative body of the highest order. It may not only frame, but also enact and promulgate a new constitution. Wow. Now, is this, and there are 5 different court cases cited here, are these court cases in harmony with the precedent of 1787? They are, aren't they? They've continued to uphold that same concept that 1787 established. The conventions represent who? The people. If they represent the people, does the state legislature have any authority to restrain them? They don't. What are our state legislators being told? Apply for this convention, and if you apply for it as a balanced budget amendment convention, you can constrain the delegates. That's the only topic they can talk about. Is that true? According to history, no. According to legal precedent, no. Are you beginning to see why Nevada said they were induced by fraud? Because the facts don't support the claims, do they? Let's go a little further here. Now, of course, ratification is the ultimate safeguard, right? It takes 3/4 of the states to ratify any amendments. Unless what? Unless they change the ratification process like they did in 1787. Now, I mentioned Robert Nadelson earlier. Here's the one that said, let's not call this a constitutional convention anymore. It doesn't play well with people. He wrote this article, How the Courts Have Clarified the Constitution's Amendment Process. Robert Nadelson, by the way, just so you know who he is, he's a former law professor out of Missoula, Montana, my home state. And he is really the root. He is the legal mind behind all conservative organizations that push for an Article 5 convention. Every group that has a conservative leaning that's pushing for an Article 5 convention bases their arguments on his arguments. It all comes down to Robert Nadelson. That's interesting. There are liberal groups that promote it as well. They don't cite him. He claimed in this article that no, the convention cannot change the ratification process. In fact, he says, no legislature or convention has the power to alter the ratification procedure. That is fixed by Article 5. And for his reference, he cites Hawk versus Smith, 1920 Supreme Court decision. Is he right? How many of you, when a law professor cites Supreme Court decisions as evidence for his claim, are going to go look that up and read 30 pages of legalese to see if he's right? I'm that guy. And I did. I looked it up. I read Hawk versus Smith, looking for where it says the convention cannot change the ratification process. And here's what it says. The language of the article is plain and admits no doubt of its interpretation. It is not the function of conventions. No, it doesn't say conventions. It's not the function of courts or legislative bodies, national or state, to alter the method in which the Constitution is fixed. Is there a problem there? Is there a problem with this? He said, Hawk versus Smith says the conventions cannot change the ratification process. Where's the word convention? It's not there. Nowhere throughout Hawk versus Smith does it ever mention a convention changing the ratification process or them not being able to do so. Which is good, because if they did, guess what? That's basically stating that the Constitution itself was illegally adopted. If a Supreme Court were ever to rule that, they would essentially be ruling the Constitution itself is invalid. And of course, they've never done that. But I had to look just to see if it's actually in there. And it's not. Now, I don't know if Professor Nadelson is intentionally making things up here, or he was just up late one night doing his research and kind of forgot what it said. I don't know. But whatever case, it's not true, is it? Let me give you a little story. A number of years ago, I got to serve on a jury. Anyone ever do that? It's kind of interesting sometimes, kind of not other times. This was an interesting one. I ended up being the chairman of the jury. And in this particular case, both sides presented powerful arguments. When it came time for jury deliberation and we went looking through all the evidence, we went into that having no idea which way we were going to decide in this case. Until we discovered something. One key witness in the case contradicted himself very clearly and plainly. But what he said in one contradicted something he said in another case. What did that tell us? He's not a reliable witness. He's covering something. And then we took every piece of evidence that came from him and set it aside. And we looked at what was left, and we had a very clear picture. And suddenly the entire jury was unanimous which way we were going to decide on that case. What does that mean here, as we apply to the Article 5 Convention topic? When we see people misrepresenting information, whether it's intentional or not, this is not a reliable source, is it? The Convention of States organization in particular has a long history of problems with that. In fact, last November, this made me chuckle a little, Last November, the founder of Convention of States, Mark Meckler, in a public meeting, a person raised their hand and said, "Would you be willing to do a public debate with Robert Brown, myself?" He said no. Why would he say no? Well, the reason he said he was saying no was because he says Robert Brown's a liar. He travels the country spreading lies about our organization. I will not go on the same stage as him. I'm saying, I'd love to go on the same stage as you because I'd love to present evidence that you don't want to address. Because he's not telling the truth. Now, it's okay, keep in mind, and I want to make this very clear. Those of your friends and neighbors who are promoting a convention, are they liars? No. Please understand that. They've been given false information. That doesn't make them a liar, does it? But when you've been given false information and someone brings the correct information to you, what was that quote we used earlier? When an honest man finds that he's wrong? That's when it's put to the test, isn't it? Are you so committed to this position you've taken that when all the evidence is against you, you're still going to cling to it? That's not intellectually honest. And at least Mark Meckler has left that one long ago. I've challenged it on many things, he refuses to answer them. And many of our good friends and neighbors are behind this movement. And it's up to us to very gently share with them, there's another side of the story. And gently help them see the other side there. Okay, and then this is the last claim they're making. The Article 5 Convention is for reining in an out-of-control government. And it's the only way we can do it. Now, if you believe it's the only option, our federal government's out of control, we can all see where this is going, right? Where the federal government, if we don't change the direction our nation's headed, it's not good. We're headed for collapse as a nation. And if this is the only option we have, even though there are tremendous risks, might it be worth trying something? Okay, yeah, maybe. I can be persuaded on, yeah, it's very risky, but where we're headed, we've got nothing to lose. But number one, it's not even what Article 5 is for. And number two, it's not the only way. And with that, let's look at the other options. For example, what is Article 5 for? Mark Meckler, this is a quote from him directly. The founders told us that if this balance of powers ever got out of control, if the federal government ever becomes unresponsive, that we were to call a convention under Article 5. Get together in conventions, propose amendments to restrain the scope, power, and jurisdiction of the federal government. Where's the founders quote in that? Notice he said the founding fathers told us. You know how many times he's cited founding fathers saying something like that? Zero. You know why? Because they've never said that. This is again historical revisionism. Slow down, say it here. Because they never said anything like that. The Article 5 Convention was not for reining in the federal government. In fact, Alexander Hamilton says it's for supplying for any defects that may be found in the Constitution. They didn't feel like what we're creating is a perfect document. It never should be changed. They'll have flaws, and so we have a way to provide for any defects that may be found in there. Madison said it's for the amendment of errors found in the Constitution. Madison also says, should the provisions of the Constitution, as here reviewed, be found not to secure the liberty and happiness of the people, let it be corrected by the amendment process. George Washington. Anyone ever read George Washington's famous farewell address? Great document. Recommended reading. You'll enjoy it. In there, one of the things he addresses is a warning. If, in the opinion of the people, the distribution or modification of constitutional powers be in any particular wrong, if we set up the structure in a wrong way and we find that there's problems with the Constitution, let it be corrected by the amendment process, but let it not be done by usurpation. For though this, in one instance, may be the instrument of good, it is the customary weapon by which free governments are destroyed. Sorry, I couldn't stop. I enjoyed that quote. What's he warning us on? Don't just let them take the power if you feel like they need it. Make a formal change by the amendment process. If you really feel like we need a federal Department of Education, which I don't, but let's say we do, then we should have amended the Constitution to establish federal power for a Department of Education, not just do it. That's Washington's warning. So what's he saying Article 5 is for? When we have actual flaws in the Constitution, well, this is pretty elementary, isn't it? If there's a flaw in the Constitution, change the Constitution. On the other hand, if there's a flaw in the people obeying the Constitution, change the people. That's pretty simple, isn't it? Now, very interestingly, Madison also addressed this question. What about using a convention for correcting breaches to the Constitution? What if they just refuse to obey it? Should we use an Article 5 convention to rein them in? That's exactly what Mark Meffler is saying it's for. That's exactly what convention promoters are saying it's for. Madison already addressed this. Federalist 49. Would it be good for correcting breaches of it? He says no. The convention, in short, would be composed chiefly of men who had been, or actually were, or were expected to be, members of the department whose conduct was arraigned. Meaning, modern English, those who've been causing the problems in government are likely to be the delegates to the convention. He thought this was a very foolish idea to try to rein in government through changing the Constitution through a convention. You jump back to Federalist 48. He talks about how crazy of an idea it is to just simply trust in words on paper to enforce themselves. You can't just write new amendments into the Constitution and expect that's going to solve everything. If you're not enforcing the Constitution now, why would changing those words on paper make any difference? It's almost as if Federalist 48 and 49 were written to Mark Meffler or to those that are promoting a convention today. Because they were promoting a convention in his day, he wrote this letter to them. This is a foolish idea. The conclusion I'm warranted in drawing from these observations is that a mere demarcation on parchment of constitutional limits of the several departments is not a sufficient guard against those encroachments which lead to a tyrannical concentration of all power. What's he saying? Words on paper don't fix anything. If you're not going to enforce them, that's the problem we have today, isn't it? Remember what I said about federal spending? How much would it trim the federal budget if we were to actually enforce the Constitution? Somewhere around $3 trillion a year, somewhere around 80%. It's not that the Constitution allows that spending. It's that we, the people, have allowed that spending. It means we don't need to change the Constitution, we need to enforce it. So change it or enforce it. This is an interesting one. Robert Kelly, this was back, actually last year, February, in Idaho, Boise, Idaho. Robert Kelly, legal counsel for the Convention of States Organization, is there presenting. Here's why we need to have this Article 5 convention. Question for you, sir. What happens when we change the Constitution and they still don't follow it? His answer was, it'll require millions of activists. Millions of activists will be needed to be involved in pressuring legislatures, and litigation will be required to enforce the changes. Follow-up question, so why don't we just do that now? Why not skip the amendment process and enforce it now? And Robert Kelly got a little frustrated and went on to another question and didn't answer. Why? Because that's the logical answer, isn't it? If you're telling us that once we make all these changes to the Constitution, we're still going to have to get out there and enforce it, why don't we do that now? And here's where I have a real problem. You'll notice I pick on the Convention of States Organization a bit. They're a very well-organized group. They're very well-funded. They do a good job of organizing. But I'm concerned about the direction they're headed because of this. Anyone know how many activist supporters do they say they have currently? I think their last count was about 3.8 million activist supporters supporting the Convention of States Organization. In my experience, how many people does it take to get your congressman obeying the Constitution? A couple hundred. In an entire congressional district, I mean in your entire state. I did that in Montana a few years ago. I organized a few hundred people. We began pressuring my congressman to follow the Constitution. And at the time, his voting record was hovering somewhere between 30 to 60% following the Constitution. That's pretty mediocre. Within about 4 months, he was at 80%. His next score was 90%. And he began to thank us for keeping him on track. He even started to refer to me as his conscience. That took a few hundred people. If this organization has 3.8 million, that means they have about 15,000 supporters per congressional district on average. Is that enough to enforce it now? Yeah, it is. And that's my simple charge. I've submitted out to Mark Meckler, the founder of the organization. If you're really serious about restoring the Constitution, let's work together and do it right now. Let's not wait to change the Constitution. Let's work together. I can teach you how we did it in Montana. And start enforcing the Constitution, putting pressure on our congressmen. Why do I focus on congressmen? They're the closest to the people, and they are the most powerful. They're actually more powerful than the president. Constitutionally, mind you. According to constitutional authority, Congress, actually the House of Representatives, more than the Senate even, controls the money. Control the purse strings. All revenue bills must begin with being introduced by the House of Representatives. No spending takes place unless the House of Representatives says so. They can defund everything and shut it down. They can also impeach. They can also dissolve the Ninth Circuit Court or other federal courts and so on. They have tremendous power to check all the other branches of the federal government if we, the people, rein them in. So I'm changing it or enforcing it. Which one would be easier? Honestly, from where we are right now, enforcing it versus changing it. And by Article 6 of the Constitution, they're supposed to be doing so anyway. I'm going to spend just a moment here on Article 6. You guys familiar with Article 6? It has 3 clauses. The first one basically says we're going to pay all our debts. But Clause 2 is the supremacy clause, which means that anything the federal government says is supreme over anything the states do, right? No. Okay, good. Glad you got that one. It says federal law is supreme when it's in following the Constitution. It says this Constitution and all the laws made in pursuance thereof, and all treaties made under the authority of the Constitution shall be supreme. So only federal law in following the Constitution is supreme. You want a good Federalist paper on that one? Federalist 33. Alexander Hamilton, not exactly a small government guy. Federalist 33, he says that laws made not in following the Constitution are merely acts of usurpation and will deserve to be treated as such. So we have the oath of office here in Article 6, Clause 3. Who's required to swear an oath of office? Everyone in any level of government, whether they are elected or appointed, whether it's national, state, or local, even military and police and so on, all are required to swear an oath of office to uphold the rulings of the Supreme Court. Oh, I'm sorry. The Constitution, regardless of the rulings of the Supreme Court, or laws of Congress, or anything else, right? So on the defensive side, the state legislatures are supposed to be upholding the Constitution, even if, and especially if the federal government isn't. And then the other side, what I'd call the offense, Congress is also required to uphold the Constitution. The reason I call the state legislature's defense, they have the position to say no to federal programs. On the offensive side, Congress can shut things down, repeal laws, and so on. In fact, there's a collection of Federalist papers that address this. I mentioned Federalist 48 and 49, where Madison says Article 5 Convention is not the way to rein in the federal government. Other Federalist papers, which would be 16, 26, 33 that I mentioned, 44, 46, talk about enforcing the Constitution. We'll go through a few of those. Federalist 46, Madison says the means of opposition are powerful and at hand. Schemes of usurpation will be easily defeated by state governments. Will be supported by the people. Both of these quotes say basically that. I like this one. And again, this is from Hamilton. I always point that out because Hamilton was not a small government guy. And yet he sure defended the idea of the states being able to say no to the federal government. Coming from Hamilton, that's amazing. Here he says, if the cooperation of the state legislatures be necessary to give effect to a measure of the Union, the states have only not to act, or to act abasely, and the measure is defeated. What's he advocating? Nullification, exactly. Now, when I was on a speech tour a year ago in Texas, it was just before that, Governor Abbott, it's actually a couple years back now, Governor Abbott had recently come out saying, I support an Article 5 convention because I'm a big advocate of the 10th Amendment, but it has no teeth. There's no enforcement power. There's no way to enforce the drawing the line in the sand between federal and state power. Local media came to me noting I'm on a speech tour opposing what he just said and asked me for a statement. You have a statement for Governor Abbott? I said, yes, I do. You want enforcement power? 3 words. Stop being complicit. Right? As a state, when the federal government gives you a requirement to implement the Real ID Act or Obamacare or whatever else it may be, as a state, you are not required to help them implement it. In fact, the Supreme Court has upheld that. It's called anti-commandeering. The states cannot be required to implement federal law. Stop being complicit. Now, Madison, of course, supports the same idea. Federalist 46. He talks about the refusal to cooperate with the officers of the Union. We're not going to help you enforce your tyranny. Well, that's a good start, but Madison takes it one step further. He also says that the state legislatures can create legislative devices to present obstructions, which the federal government would be hardly willing to encounter. What does that mean? Not only do you not help them implement their unconstitutional laws, you also block it. We're going to arrest any federal agent that comes in here trying to implement any red flag laws, for example. I've seen that actually proposed as legislation. That'd be a good one to do. You do a federal red flag law, it will not be implemented in Montana or Wyoming. You'll probably get that passed here. Still takes some work. State governors admit the federal government needs help from the states to implement most federal programs. What does that mean? Most federal programs are run for the federal government by the states. And yeah, they are unfunded liabilities. And that means that's where the shutoff valve is, Governor Abbott. You can turn these off. And this concept of nullification is growing tremendously nationwide. We're seeing more and more states standing up saying no. Nullification has been used successfully hundreds of times in our nation's history. Just to simply say no to the federal government. Now, the people also have tremendous power. As I mentioned with Montana, Madison refers to the people as the ultimate redress. He talks about the power of the disquietude of the people. When was the last time you used that word? Disquietude. My children are really good at disquietude. Disquietude, simply meaning the people are speaking out against your actions as a public servant. If you're an elected official seeking re-election and there's too much disquietude among your constituents, your chances for re-election are going down, right? They recognize that. I had an interesting interview with the lieutenant governor recently. He was a former congressman. He said, as a congressman, the most surprising thing I noticed there was that Congress is actually really quite responsive to their constituents. How many feel that's true? Well, I don't feel that. I call my congressman, he doesn't pay attention to me. No, it's true, actually. When you call him by yourself, no, he's probably not going to pay much attention. But when enough of you are calling your congressman on an issue, it becomes a big enough issue, they do pay attention to it. And generally will follow on what the people want, when enough of them want it. He used, for an example, balanced budget. It's generally promoted that this idea of a balanced budget is supported by the people in large numbers across the country, right? The people want the federal government to balance their books. Why haven't they done it? Because Congress is not responsive to the people? No. His answer was, because the people want it, but they don't want it more than they want their other programs. And we can't balance the budget and give them their higher priorities at the same time. But when the balanced budget becomes the higher priority, they will do it immediately. That's what he was saying. You know, I agree. With my experience with my own congressman, I agree. When enough of the people say, we want you to follow the Constitution, they will. The people can elect more faithful representatives. Here's my favorite one. Again, this one from Hamilton. I just find that kind of cool. Constitutional enforcement would require a people enlightened enough to distinguish between a legal exercise and an illegal usurpation of authority. What is that saying so far? We need to have people that are enlightened enough to understand when they're following the Constitution and when they are not. That is why I created a course on the Constitution. I want people to easily be able to understand that, be able to draw that line between what is and what is not Constitution. How many people feel like you can pass a test on the Constitution right now? I have one I can give you. 10 questions I often give on my speeches. It's actually not queued up right now. It's kind of fun. We were talking about it a little bit earlier. The hardest question on it, I'm going to give you that one only. What are the 5 purposes for which the federal government can own and control land within a state? Raise your hand if you can think of 5 stated purposes found in Article 1, Section 8, Clause 17, for which the federal government can own and control land. Can anyone do it? I've got one hand back here. That's a tough one, isn't it? Not just the abbreviated version, but what are the actual words? 5 purposes. The first one is
Munitions,
no. Pretty close. Forts, magazines, arsenals,
harbors,
dockyards, and then other needful buildings, which would include post offices. Forts, magazines, arsenals, dockyards, and other needful buildings. That's generally the hardest question in the quiz, so we'll leave it at that. Do you see the problem here, though? When the federal government proposes new BLM land, we're going to create some more wilderness area or something like that. Excuse me, there are other requirements as well. The land must be purchased by the consent of the state legislature and for one of those 5 purposes. I proposed a bill in Montana a few years ago saying that any new federal land takings must comply with those requirements. Legislative services initially refused to even print the bill. You can't tell the federal government what to do. Yes, we can.
Yeah.
And it got only a few votes in committee because most state legislators were afraid to even vote for it. We need to educate them more. They need to hear from their constituents more. Continuing on though, I love this quote. So people that can distinguish between what is constitutional and not, and as the natural guardians of the Constitution. What did he just call you? We the people are the natural guardians of the Constitution. We can throw our weight into the national scale and give it a decided preponderance in the contest. Ultimately, the people can decide any issue through their pressure, which is exactly what we did when I ran in my own congressman. To conclude with a few quotes here. Thomas Jefferson, if a nation expects to be ignorant and free, it expects what never was and never will be. I want you to memorize that one. It's kind of poetic. The nation expects to be ignorant and free, expects what never was and never will be. You know what he's saying to me? Any political action plan trying to save our nation that doesn't solve the ignorance in our nation is trying to prove him wrong. Sure, we can be ignorant and free. No. Yes, that's the Article 5 Convention movement, but there's a lot of others as well. If they're not going to solve the ignorance of the people, it will fail to restore liberty. Because you cannot force liberty on an ignorant public. As much as I'd like to do it, you can't force liberty on people that don't love liberty and understand it and defend it. Next quote on here. James Garfield. This would really put this president on the map for me. Now more than ever before, the people are responsible for the character of their Congress. It's kind of an ominous statement, isn't it? You're responsible for Congress. If that body be ignorant, reckless, and corrupt, it's because the people tolerate ignorance, recklessness, and corruption. Can you imagine Congress fitting that description? Ignorant, reckless, corrupt? Takes a little imagination, I know. On the other hand, though, he says, if it be intelligent, brave, and pure, it's because the people demand these high qualities to represent them in the national legislature. Where's the power here? We the people. We the people are the problem. And we the people are the solution. We need to change the people. Now, just before I came up here, Bob Bechtel was talking about some classes, right? To learn more about the foundation of our country and the Constitution. My number one recommendation to you on that one is be Paul. My friend invited me to a class in my living room. You could achieve 100 if everyone in this room were to, how many do we have? About 20 or so, 25? 3 to 4 times this year, host a class in someone else's living room. If everyone in here did it once, you'd have a few hundred people go through that class by the end of the year. If we all decided to be Paul, and I'm going to hold this in your living room because you're not showing up at my house when I hold it there. I did that to a good friend of mine, his name's Mark. He always said he wanted to show up. And he did once we went to his house. Now this, I admit, I know Thomas Edison's not a founding father, but the statement had to be included. The strength of the Constitution lies in the will of the people to defend it. I've seen the same statement attributed to Einstein, to Edison. I'm not sure for sure who actually said it. I can probably just take the picture off of there and just say author unknown. But it's true, isn't it? That is the problem our nation's facing. We don't need to change the Constitution. We need to help heal the people. The Power of 500 is a DVD. It's also available on YouTube. It's a presentation where I go into more detail of what we did in Montana to get my congressman following the Constitution. We use the Freedom Index. The Freedom Index is the John Birch Society's magazine, The New American. Twice per year they come out with the voting records of Congress compared to the Constitution. And by that, my congressman was not doing very well. Here's my congressman, Denny Reber. He scored as low as 30%, up to a 67 once. He got back down to 60 when I moved to Montana in 2009. And as we launched this Power 500, we got to the point where we had a couple hundred people helping spread his voting record around the state and got to 80%. We kept pressuring him, kept working on him. 80% on the next score, 90% on the next one, 90% on the next one after that. You see a change? Yeah. At that point, he started calling me, Mr. Brown is my conscience. And actually publicly thanking me and our team for keeping him honest for his words. Congress is actually a lot more responsive than we realized. When we organize our effort, when we work in a coordinated fashion, we do have power. I was speaking with, earlier with, regarding the, your congresswoman. Who's your congresswoman? Liz Cheney. Liz Cheney. I'm not sure how responsive she'd be. Maybe yes, maybe no. She's pretty headstrong. But most politicians, when they begin to recognize the votes are going away, start to reconsider. She might be fixable. And I don't care which one it is. You need to repair them or replace them, right? Either one works for me. So here's the ultimate action plan, really. The way to save the Constitution, according to the founders, is to enforce it. We need to learn it. How can you defend a Constitution that we don't know? I do recommend my Constitution course. It's the best one out there by my perspective, of course. The reason why really is that my Constitution course was designed for what you need to know as an activist to draw that line between what they should be doing and shouldn't be doing and apply the pressure accordingly. We need to understand who are the enemies of the Constitution. We'll go into some of that as well. It's really designed for someone who wants to know how to defend the Constitution. I do recommend reading the Constitution itself. Federalist Papers, Anti-Federalist Papers, Madison's notes from the Federal Convention in 1787. All those are very good for getting a deeper understanding of the arguments, what was on their mind when they wrote this clause and that clause. I cover a lot of that in my lecture series as well. But hopefully I can spark in you some of that hunger that Paul sparked in me. My dear wife put up with a lot because I was up till wee hours of the morning for weeks studying the Constitution once he ignited me. She finally had to pull me aside and say, don't forget you have children. You need to be dad again. But the key is this. We need to learn the Constitution, and then we need to help others learn it. Magnify your voice. We need to bring other people along so that your vote and your voice is heard by your congressmen, by your senators, by your state legislators, by your governor. I have to say, Wyoming is really a fairly conservative state if they were pointed in the right direction. If they really understood principles of liberty and the Constitution, I think most people here would embrace it. How well do they know the Constitution now, as a state? If we were to give my 10-question quiz across Wyoming, average score, without even seeing the quiz, average score, what do you think? 20%? That's probably high, actually. Nationally, the average score we've estimated would probably come in somewhere around less than 1 out of 10. Wyoming might be a little higher than that. So you might get 1 to 2 as an average score for the state. In this room, it'd probably average about, typically in groups like this, it's more like about 6 or 7 out of 10. So, okay. Oh, I have to emphasize one living room at a time, right? Best way to spread the information is one living room at a time. The New York Times isn't going to do this for us. CNN isn't going to do this for us. Even Fox News isn't going to do this for us. It's done person by person, personal contact, living room by living room. That's where the power is. I can't do it all myself. No one can. But if each of us reach out to our circle of influence and just share it with another person before the end of the year, how much would this grow? I do recommend, we have a few materials here and back on the table there as well. My lecture series is available up here for anyone that's interested in studying the Constitution on that. I have a few other materials here. 2 presentations I've given on the Article Convention topic. One that goes a lot more into their claims and debunks them, and the other one goes a little deeper into the Article 6 solution as well. My final statement here. I want you to remember this, because this is really the solution. When we, the people, understand and demand adherence to the Constitution, it will be followed. It really is that simple. It's a lot of work, but it really is that simple. But with that, I implore you, please help us sustain and defend the Constitution. Learn it and spread that knowledge. And we really can turn the tide. Thank you for coming out tonight. Let's stick around for questions. Thank you. So according to the schedule here, we have till about 8:25 for questions and answers. Does anyone have any questions they want to start us off with? Go ahead.
I know I've heard you before. I'm not sure I've heard this full presentation yet. But your reasoning and your rationale is how I've argued, debated, and discussed against some of my very good friends in the political world in Wyoming that are advocating an Article 5 convention. And why would we change the Constitution that they're not obeying now is never answered properly.
Sure.
Now, so I think this is the best solution, best presentation, no doubt. Is there any other as far as, have you looked at Republic Review, which is supposed to be an audit of the federal government? And can you explain if that's a, that seems almost like putting your congressman on trial for not following the
Right.
Constitution. Could you
I don't
address
know
that?
the intimate details on the Republic Review proposal. The basic idea is simply multiple states kind of working in a coordinated effort on reviewing federal actions for their constitutionality and then holding them accountable to it. Is that kind of the basic concept there? One thing I do know is that the gentleman who has kind of proposed this whole concept also includes that later in the process we also have an Article 5 convention as part of the Republic Review proposal. I think you know where I stand on that one by now. If not, probably slept in my presentation. So I definitely oppose the Article 5 convention aspect. The idea of states coordinating their efforts in opposing federal violations of the Constitution, definitely. That's something that they have done a number of times in the past. Real ID Act, for example. Back in 2005, Congress passed this very unconstitutional national ID card with national database and personal information and things like that. And 12 states, almost simultaneously, passed nullification bills, saying we will not allow this to be implemented in our state. And then other states heard about that and started to pass similar bills. It eventually got up to 28 states had passed nullification bills saying we will not be implementing the Real ID Act. And for as long as they would stand that ground, they win. Which you can tell by what I'm implying there, they haven't stood their ground since then. The federal government, anyone fly very often over the years? You may have noticed a little TSA sign as you're going through the line waiting to be frisked. As of a certain date, citizens of the following states will no longer be able to use their IDs to fly on the national airlines because of the Real ID Act. And if you've flown for very many years, you'll notice that that sign has been put up again and again, and the date keeps changing. As of this date, okay, we didn't mean that one. How about this date? Okay, we didn't mean that one either. What about this date? They just keep backing up a little further, a little further. But through the years, now that was 2005 when it first came along. Here we are, 2019 now. And they're down to about 6 states that haven't fully complied yet. And one by one, they've kind of picked them off, threatening. If the states stood their ground, they never would have to buckle on that one. The states need to know their strength and stand their ground. But that is an example of what can happen when the states say no. If you have one state that says no, that's a hard one to do. Utah did that with the No Child Left Behind Act. And it took about 48 hours to get them to buckle. With federal agents landing in Salt Lake City saying they're going to pull federal funding from any state department that receives any federal funding. And they backed down because they stood alone. They were one state, and the people of Utah weren't ready to see all their federal funded programs go away. So nullification on the state level like that really is best in a coordinated fashion. So that aspect of the Republic Review concept is something that has been done historically a number of times successfully. That's definitely a good thing. I coordinate with various legislators across the country and help them coordinate with each other because I travel the country speaking on the Constitution fairly regularly. I get to know the good constitutionalists in every community I go to. And so getting state legislators coordinating is an excellent aspect. Definitely. There was a hand here, I think, and then, okay, go ahead, and then back here.
The western states, one of the big hot button issues is, the public, quote, public lands.
Yeah.
And you referenced Article 1, 817, and there's also the property clause that people get into the weeds on. Cliven Bundy went through that mess down there, and he still claims, the feds had no jurisdiction to, charge him grazing fees. Can you comment on your, I don't know if it would be opinion or what the Constitution says on, the public lands?
Yeah, absolutely. You mentioned 2 clauses. First one being Article 1, Section 8, Clause 17. Second one being the Properties Clause, which is part of the 4, and I can't remember exactly which
Section
clause.
3, yeah.
Yeah. And And the properties clause refers to properties owned by the federal government, like territories. And that's where we kind of get a little bit confusing, but it's very simple, really. When it comes down to once an area, a territory of the United States becomes a state, we don't recognize this today because we've come so far away from the original intent. But a state was a sovereign nation, like the nations of Europe were when I was a child. Not anymore. Each individual state was a sovereign nation. And when it got its statehood, it was basically now sovereign within its boundaries, with exceptions listed in Article 1, Section 8, Clause 17, forts, magazines, arsenals, dockyards, and federal buildings. Part of the agreement the states had when they are formed was that the federal government holding lands within those states would be turning that federal land over to the states in short order. In fact, there's what's the name of that organization that's pushing for federal lands to be turned over to the states?
American Lands Council?
American Lands Council, thank you. That's one of their arguments there, is that you agreed to give us the land, here we are hundreds of years later or more, and it's not happening, and it should be. I will state, when it comes to American Land Council, I have a few friends that are very concerned about some of the devils in the details on that organization. That the land, according to their proposal, is not turned over to the states, it's turned over to an interstate compact trust that is then controlled outside of the state still. Not actually turned over to the state. So although on the surface it looks like let's turn over the land to the states, it isn't really. But does that kind of answer the question? Really the only purpose for which the federal government should have any land within a state is those five. Who can remember?
Forts, arsenals.
Forts,
Other
magazines,
needful
arsenals.
buildings.
Two more.
The other needful buildings.
Dockyards, ports, yeah.
Needful.
And other needful buildings, yeah. Good.
So it's your opinion that the federal government really has no jurisdiction, just like what Cliven says?
Oh, absolutely.
Yeah, good.
Absolutely.
Glad to hear it.
As you look through again, when there's a question, go to the original sources. Go to the arguments in the 1787 Convention, the discussion that led to that clause. Go to their supporting arguments, the Federalist Papers, the opposing arguments, the Anti-Federalist Papers. You get a full picture. And it was never the intent for the federal government to be holding lands except as needed on a very limited basis in the state. No BLM lands, wilderness areas, forest areas, whatever that might be. Question at the back. Yeah.
So I don't mean to be, I just want to go back to public review. You did state that it does require that, whatever that review is, it does involve an Article 5.
An Article 5 convention, yes.
So you're just saying that their intent is good, what they're trying to accomplish, but the process of the public review
Right.
is dangerous.
Definitely. The first half of the proposal of establishing an interstate discussion on constitutionality and standing up together is definitely needs to be done. But their plan does include an Article 5 convention, and for that reason alone, I would not support the organization at all. Because I didn't go into this, but let me do this for just a moment. What would happen with an Article 5 convention? What do I predict? How would it go? I'm going to jump ahead to a slide here. I have about an extra 100 slides here. Is there a Soros Convention of States connection? Now, on my side of the argument, those that are opposed to a convention, they'll often say, George Soros is working with Convention of States. That is not true. We've never seen any documentation that George Soros is in any way funding the Convention of States organization. We do see financial ties between the Koch brothers and Convention of States. There is that. But on the Soros side, no. However, there is an indirect connection between Soros and Convention of States. And that's this man, because he works with both. Lawrence Lessig. He is a good friend of Mark Meckler. They've traveled the country together, hosting many events promoting an Article 5 convention. Lawrence Lessig was a former Obama campaign advisor, Bilderberg attendee. He declared declares it's time to rewrite the Constitution. Very liberal. And he would love to see, let's just review the entire Constitution and scrap everything that we feel is necessary. He wants a truly open Article 5 convention where everything is on the table. And he works side by side with Meckler in Convention of States, promoting let's have an Article 5 convention. He is also funded by George Soros on a lot of organizations that he runs. Soros funded. Does that mean that there's a Soros connection with Convention of States? Not really. But there is a Soros guy that works with the founder of Convention of States because they both have the same goal. We want to have a convention. You're shaking your head. Is this untrue? Is this not true? Does he not work with?
They were acquaintances. They got to know each other. As far as people, they like each other, no problem. He does not work for Convention of States.
So a year and a half ago, December 2017, an organization called Intelligence Squared hosted a debate where Meckler and Lessig, side by side, were the supporters of the convention argument, and then two other professors were the opposition to the convention. And Lessig introduced Mark Meckler as my good friend whom I've worked with for a very long time. So you're saying that's not true?
We worked with them when we first finding out about Article 5.
Yeah.
About 10 years.
Yeah, well, and actually just a year and a half ago.
Well, for the debate,
They also did the Harvard Con together. So they have worked together, according to Lessig, a long time. But I do want to downplay this whole idea of Soros is funding Convention of States and that kind of thing. There's never been any proof of that. There is, however, definitely liberal support. Oh, here's my, yeah, this is that Intelligence Squared debate where he introduces them as my good friend. But on the liberal side, is there a lot of support for a convention?
yes.
There is. Now, the Convention of States organization points to this. 230 organizations oppose calls for a constitutional convention, or an Article 5 convention, whatever you want to call it. And so in fact, I've seen Meckler often say, for example, if you oppose a convention, you're siding with liberals. A lot of these are Soros-funded groups. So you're siding with George Soros. If you oppose a convention, you're siding with George Soros. Is that true? Well, there's something missing from this argument because there's 230 organizations that have declared their opposition to a convention. And I looked up how many liberal organizations support and have endorsed having an Article 5 convention. And I found a few. In fact, just short of 600. So 230 organizations, several of which have funds coming from Soros, oppose a convention. Nearly 600, also several of which have funding coming from George Soros, are promoting a convention. So which one am I siding with Soros on? If I oppose it, or if I am in favor of it? Do you see how both arguments are untrue? If I say, if you support a convention, you're siding with Soros, that's not really honest, is it? Has George Soros ever come out publicly and said where he stands on it? No. Okay, we should probably stop speaking for him. Have liberal organizations funded by Soros been on both sides of the argument? Yes. Most notable, though, this one I find interesting, because this one is a little bit of a predictor of the future. Anyone ever hear of The Nation magazine? Good conservative publication that I have on my coffee table, right? No? A little bit middle? A little bit more? I'm going the wrong way. Let's go left.
Yeah.
Way left, out the door, and to the parking lot. Yeah. So The Nation magazine is pretty liberal. In fact, here's an article they came out with. What was the date on this one? November 2017. The U.S. Constitution is over 2 centuries old and showing its age. And they're feeling like it's time to just revise or even replace the entire document. In this article, this one surprised me. In this article, they say, though it has the most states signed up thus far, the movement for a balanced budget amendment isn't the only one eyeing an Article 5 convention. So what are they talking about? They're talking about conservatives, such as the Balanced Budget Amendment Group, pushing for an Article 5 convention. They then mention the Convention of States project advocates for one that wouldn't be limited to the Balanced Budget Amendment, but would be free to consider other small government reforms. Okay, so they're talking about there's a conservative side to this Article 5 amendment process. And then, rather than ridicule the efforts to adapt the Constitution to present day, small d Democrats ought, with eyes wide open, to join them. What are they saying? They're suggesting that liberals should be supporting the Convention of States organization and Balanced Budget Amendment Task Force Group and any other conservative groups pushing for a convention. Why? The key is a simple compromise. We get to consider our proposals if you get to consider yours. That's their agenda. So what do they have in mind if we ever help the Convention of States organization get to 34 states applying for a convention? If we ever get to that convention, the key is a simple compromise. And what do they want on the table? Everything? Well, yeah, actually. Specifically, though, Sanford Levinson, for example, suggests we should consider the adequacy of the Constitution, perhaps draft a new one, turn it over to the American people. You remember I mentioned that earlier. Turn it over to the American people for a simple majority vote of the American people. So change ratification to just a majority of the people. Another one. We're not leaving the Constitutional Convention without also securing campaign finance reform and abolishing the Electoral College. What's the campaign finance reform one about? They want to eliminate the corruption of money in politics by making all political campaigns publicly funded with your tax dollars. Which means that government would then become the gatekeeper on those funds and determining whether or not you're a viable enough candidate to get any funding. I don't see anything going wrong with that, do you? Okay, maybe you do. By the way, this is a major issue on the liberal side that they want a convention for. Those that are promoting a convention, those on the liberal side that have endorsed a convention, these are their top two. And so the key is a simple compromise. Here's what I anticipate would happen. We're going to propose a balanced budget amendment, and no, we're not going to let this balanced budget amendment see the light of day unless it is coupled with a repeal of the Electoral College. Okay? Ratify it or not, that's your package deal. And every balanced budget amendment proposal I've seen has some major flaws. For example, the one that right now that is passed in Wyoming, you know what it says? Has anyone read it? It says that we want Congress to be required to balance the budget in the absence of a national emergency. Would that fix anything? When was the last time we had a national emergency? The answer is right now. When was the last time we did not have a national emergency? And the answer was, I was about 7 years old. The last time we had we did not have a national emergency declaration was about 1978, 1979. We've been under constant national emergency declarations. We're under about 30 right now. When would Congress be required to balance the budget under that proposal? Never. So the application that your state currently has for a balanced budget amendment would accomplish what? Nothing good. It could cause harm. On the one hand, it could introduce also the Electoral College repeal. But on the other hand, it also can harm the Constitution. If you say that Congress has to balance the budget, the way they end up being worded effectively says Congress can spend money on anything they want to as long as the budget is balanced. Would that be a problem? You just eliminated the enumerated powers. That's how most balanced budget amendment proposals read. Could it do harm? Yeah, it could. So in exchange for a balanced budget amendment that doesn't balance the budget, are you willing to give up the Electoral College? That's the way I see this playing out. And anyway, just to give a basic idea here. The other factor is the first thing we started with. If it's a balanced budget amendment convention, can they discuss anything else? The Nation magazine says so. That's their plan, isn't it? What does history tell us? Yeah. What does legal precedent tell us? Yeah. Anything's on the table. Were there any last questions here? Over here?
Just quickly, out of the weeds, relative to the gist of what you said there, term limits.
Term limits. Regarding term limits, has anyone ever read the founders' wording on term limits, their writings on the topic? Under the Articles of Confederation, they had term limits. And in the 1787 convention, they felt that was an opportunity to correct grave error by eliminating term limits. Why? Does anyone know their arguments against term limits? I raise my hand. They wrote a lot about it, by the way. I thought you might know. They wrote a lot about why they felt term limits were dangerous. Let me put it in this perspective. First of all, you know what a lame duck session is of Congress. After the election, prior to the swearing in of the new Congress, there's about a month where Congress is in session. Why is the lame duck session so known as being a bad thing? No accountability, exactly. I'm your U.S. Congressman, you just voted to not re-elect me. And I'm in there for another month. What do I get to do now? Anything I want to. Who am I going to listen to? Highest bidder. And you're not the highest bidder anymore. You just lost your vote. You've already voted me out, but I'm not out.
George Soros.
Yeah. And so because of that, the lame duck session of Congress is well known to be the time to pass those unpopular bills. Easier time to get them through. What the lame duck session of Congress is right now would be magnified massively with term limits. Because now, as your congressman, I just entered my final term. I'm term limited, and I have 2 years before I'm out of office. And I have nothing to gain from you. I have no reason to listen to you for 2 years. Or if I'm your U.S. Senator, that's 6 years. That I am in like a lame duck for 6 years as your U.S. Senator because I have no opportunity for re-election. I have no reason to listen to you, so who am I listening to? You've just taken the lame duck session problem and magnified it massively. That's what the Founding Fathers explained was the problem they felt with term limits. In fact, one of them said, you're saying to him, make hay while the sun shines. You may as well do anything you can while you're still in there because you're out of here soon. So yeah, the founders were very against term limits, as am I. I used to support them. I used to feel they were a good idea. Study has changed my mind as I began to read the founders. You know what? They might know what they were talking about. Go ahead.
This has nothing to do with the Constitutional Convention.
Sure.
However, are you aware that from the 19th to the 22nd of this month, there's a group called America in One Room meeting in Dallas, Fort Worth, Texas, that they're going to discuss the issues of the 2020 elections?
Not aware of it. No.
I'm going.
You're going. That should be interesting.
Yes.
I expect a full report. I won't be there. We had a hand up here and then go to the back and then we can wrap it up.
If the goal is to understand and adhere to the Constitution by enforcing that, holding your congressional representatives accountable, where would the concern rise from them bringing the fallout from a potential constitutional convention to the popular vote if you effectively mobilize your activists?
Where would be the concern of the Constitutional Convention if we've effectively mobilized our activists? Is that a summary? Okay. 2 things. Number one, at that point you don't really need to. I'm not opposed to amending the Constitution. There are a few things in there I feel like should be changed, such as the 17th Amendment, 16th Amendment. What are the circumstances in which I feel like a Constitutional Convention would be safe? When the American people, by and large, understand and love and embrace liberty. And even then I'd be a little leery. But, in fact, Madison, in his opposition to it, he said he would tremble at the thought of having a convention in the present temper of America. And in a later letter he said, in the present ferment of parties. Times of political convulsion, chaos, was what was scaring him. Having a convention under those circumstances would be chaotic. If, on the other hand, like then, in 1787, we had just won our independence from tyranny, and although we had political differences, the general mentality was restrain government power, which is why we got such a wonderful document. The Constitution very limited government minded because that was the general mindset of the people. What is it today? Instead of freedom, it's free stuff, right? Yeah. If we were to have a full convention where we reconsider the entire Constitution like Sanford Levinson and Lawrence Lessig suggest, we were to move the Constitution to today's center of political thought, would that be closer to the views of Marks or Madison? Everyone always says that. Why? It's reality, isn't it? And so, as far as that goes, on the one hand, before we get to the point where we have enough people really defending liberty that I feel comfortable with the convention, we would have enough to enforce liberty. It'd take quite a bit more to the point where rewriting a new constitution would be a comfortable thing to me, or even making major changes to it. Does that make sense?
It makes sense.
I'm a little leery of people messing with the founding document, especially when it's not the cause of the problems we're facing. Okay, last question.
We had a governor candidate a few years back, I forget when he ran. One of the things he ran on that I think scared some people, but I appreciate it. He was talking about the federal government taking over our land. He said something like, if they come in to our state, I'm gonna run them out. I'll have the sheriffs and whoever to tell them to get out.
That's the other, yeah.
Yeah, so your thought on that?
Yeah, if they're breaking the law, that's what he said,
Yeah.
Well, yeah.
There occasionally in history are people who have backbone. And I greatly admire it. There, for example, I don't know if I can remember who this was. I can't remember. Sorry, good story that I'm not going to be able to share. But as you read through Federalist 16 from Hamilton, as you read through Federalist 46, Madison, those two in particular are backbone type documents. Hamilton talking about the states. If the assistance of the states are needed in implementing any federal law, all they need to do is not act or act evasively. Madison in Federalist 46, they create legislative devices to block implementation. That sounds like Taylor, doesn't it?
Yeah, it does.
It does. Today, the states are largely beaten into submission. One of the most common mentalities that I hear as I travel the country in state houses is, the federal government has spoken, we must obey. Yeah. That's not what the Supremacy Clause says. Everyone would do well to read Federalist 33. That's not what the Supremacy Clause is about.
We saw that on the Supreme Court when they same-sex marriage.
Yeah.
Our governor folded like a tent.
Yeah.
He said, we gotta do it. And there were other things he could have done.
Well, certainly. And this is one of the reasons why I don't run for public office, at least at this time, was I wouldn't get any traction, because I'm too honest. I wear my opinion on my shirt sleeve. And I would have no problem with telling the federal government to take a hike. But the people aren't ready to support that yet. And that's the problem. The reason Taylor didn't win, really, is not enough of Wyoming are ready for that mentality, are ready for freedom. Freedom is a little scary, especially when we're so far removed from it. Okay, we need to wrap up, so we'll take one quick one.
Well, yeah, we saw that big time with the Affordable Care Act. When I had legislation to nullify it, no support.
Yeah.
We need to get the people behind things like that.
And that's what it comes down to. The legislature needs to be supported by the people. They need to feel that support before they're going to make those bold statements, make that strong stand. So we've got a little bit past your time for the...
There was shenanigans in the legislature when that
Right, thank you.